right. Thank you very much for the intro, and more importantly, for having us today. Great to be here, and of course, very much looking forward to sharing a few thoughts on our side. Great to see many entrepreneurs and operators building in a space we love. So we have prepared a short presentation today, effectively touching upon a couple of things. Why we're excited about B2B Marketplace, and a few suggestions and things for founders and operators to look for. But before we jump into it, a few words on ourselves. Accel is a global venture firm. We've been active in the market for the last 4 decades, with presence on the ground in Europe, with our office in London, in Asia, with our office in Bangalore, and of course in the US with our office in Palo Alto, where we get started. Over the last 4 decades, we've been investing across many categories, not just marketplaces, but also software, fintech, and consumer internet stories. But speaking about marketplaces, it's fair to say that we love them. So we've been quite active, as I said, over the last few decades about both B2C and B2B models. And we've been privileged and honored to back quite a few of these names on this chart that have ended up creating category-defining businesses. Now, I think it's fair to say that many of operators and investors as alike has been primarily focused on B2C models over the last few decades. We think that B2B is actually very interesting now, and as a category has been quite overlooked. And there are quite a few fundamental reasons for that. We'll talk about it later, but let's first maybe look together at some of the stats we put on this slide. B2B, if you look at it as a proxy of just e-commerce spent, it is approaching $20 trillion spent, which is 3 times the amount of money that we as consumers spend online, which I find a staggering number. Then if you look at some of the verticals that we put in the middle of this chart, it's just an example. Anecdotally, you will see a multitude of verticals that have not been yet touched by digitalization and innovation. So we feel excited about the prospect of attacking them. When we look at Europe, unfortunately, we're a bit behind. So again, using the proxy of B2B commerce, Europe is representing less than 10%, and actually more close to 7% at the moment, of commerce share. Asia is leading the way, and there are a few historical reasons. But again, using the proxy vis-à-vis consumer, Europe is roughly 1/3 of that journey. So plenty of room for Europe to catch up. And why we think is the case, there are some clear tailwinds. On one side, you have the natural absence of some pan-European dominant player. We don't have Alibaba, we don't have Amazon, we don't have Udan that is dominating the market. On the other side, we have a great, strong heritage and tradition of manufacturing and industrial capabilities in our continent. And then you have some more tactical factors that has been accelerated by macroeconomics and geopolitical issues that we've faced over the last few years, with many supply chains that has been reshored or changed with a deeper focus on going local. And then, of course, you do have the European capabilities of bringing different countries and different issues together from day one. But worth remembering is not that easy. Building in B2B marketplaces actually is very tough. And this is just a quick process flow that reminds people that they need to take care of multiple different angles that are very different from the ones that you need to crack when focusing on consumers. That said, we feel that it's quite special time. We think that the timing is right for a few reasons. I think each one of us has been used at B2C kind of like experience in everyday life. That is actually happening now for any operator in industry. So you will have naturally people that are working at procurement departments, that are working in industrial work, that are actually looking for B2C kind of experience. On the other side, you have a continuous search for efficiency, primarily driven by savings, but not only savings in terms of monetarization, but also in terms of time. Nobody wants to do repetitive manual tasks anymore. And then, of course, you have the pandemic that have accelerated the shift online in many of the services and engagement tools that have been used by all of us. So that was a brief intro on why we feel excited about the broader opportunity. And we now have a few suggestions and things that we thought were useful to share with many of the operators and founders in the room. So all yours, Varun.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. So what we'll do in the next 15 or 20 minutes is I'll quickly walk through what we think are the 5 things founders should really focus on as they build and scale their B2B marketplaces. And then finally, I'll conclude with walking you through a few pointers that we at Accel look for and focus on as we assess opportunities in this space. So this is a quick preview of what's to come, but let me go through each one slide by slide. So typically, when we've come across B2B marketplaces, we've always seen that they are replacing existing processes that exist offline. So typically, it's not a category creation play. These value chains exist. And what these digital or tech-enabled marketplaces are trying to do is remove the inefficiencies that exist in the offline world. So what I've shown here is a typical value chain. Each industry and each vertical will be slightly different. It comprises your suppliers and your buyers. These suppliers typically sell to distributors who then store and transfer the goods to the buyers. And there's some sort of payment terms involved where buyers receive the goods, check whether they're OK, and then eventually pay the suppliers. Now, what we wanted to show was, and wanted to give an example of what Fair did in the retail wholesale space. And what Fair identified was that there was this offline sales process, trade shows, where retailers and brands would meet, and effectively, brands would sell their wares to retailers, but it was highly inefficient. And so they decided to digitize this part of the value chain and found out that not only was this the biggest pain point, it also meant that it held the most value as it related to the different entities. So each entity in this value chain clearly takes its share. And the message really here is for founders to identify in their respective industries what are the different parts of the value chain, which part of the value chain is the biggest pain point, and likely that is the part of the value chain that will hold the most value. It's important to stress here that each industry is slightly different. When you look at the B2B grocery industry, you have multiple levels of distributors. Some of them do sorting and grading. Others are involved in storage and transport. But it's really honing in on that important piece of the value chain that's important. And the last point I'll mention is, as we've seen some of these marketplaces grow, it's often not easy to go directly to the part of the value chain that holds the most value. So as a founder, you may have to navigate your way through these different parts of the value chain, but it's important to keep your eyes on the prize. Next, Luca mentioned how B2C and B2B marketplaces are different, and we see this especially in purchase and buyer behavior. Now, in B2C marketplaces, the 3 things that stand out are convenience, cost, and selection. So we've seen this with the quick grocery models that came up a few years ago, as well as in the food delivery models, where consumers were just focused on convenience. They did not want to leave their homes, and they want everything delivered in a short time frame to their homes. When it comes to price, we've seen Uber and Lyft and many other players talk about how growth and significant growth can be unlocked by simply reducing the cost that consumers are willing to pay for a ride. And finally, selection, right? So Amazon is trying to become the one-stop shop for anything that a consumer would want. But in B2B, it's very different. So you need to submit, when you think of buying a good, you first submit a purchase request. You then research vendors and get quotes. You then select these vendors, issue a purchase order. And finally, after receiving the goods, you end up making the payment. So the types of factors that B2B buyers consider are very different. And we think that the 3 things that really stand out are compliance, quality, and cost. Now, when it comes to compliance, given you have so many stakeholders in the buying process, it's very important to ensure that you are tackling the needs of each of these stakeholders, because you just need one person to block that purchase. Quality. So quality is not restricted only to the good itself, but it's the whole package. So it's things like payment terms, things like returns. Everything needs to be considered. And finally, cost. So when we compare to B2C marketplaces, we've seen B2B marketplaces typically have a lower take. And that's primarily driven by businesses being pretty forceful, bargaining hard, with suppliers. So as far as founders are concerned, listening to buyers and understanding their needs across the entire purchase lifecycle is really important, and that's what's crucial to building a winning solution and a winning marketplace. So when it comes to the supply side, we strongly believe that founders need to layer in heterogeneous supply into their marketplace. And let me walk you through what we mean by that. On the B2C side, and I've used an example of Airbnb. So they have a very heterogeneous supply, at least in terms of accommodation. It varies by location, obviously, by price, but most importantly, in the type of accommodation that they offer. When Airbnb started, they obviously built liquidity, in one type of accommodation, and now have really spread out and diversified. What it means is that today, as Airbnb stands, it's very difficult to disrupt them. So you may have a player that comes up, offering rentals in central Berlin or in central London, but you're unlikely to have that one-stop shop where you can go to any of your rental needs across the world. It's unlikely that you'll find another player that becomes as big. Now, when it comes to B2B, I wanted to use the example of one of our portfolio companies in India called Captain Fresh. So they play in the seafood and fish supply marketplace. So this is a market that's highly unorganized, very fragmented. It has very heterogeneous supply in terms of species of fish, how big they are, the quality of the fish. This is further complicated by the fact that on any given day, a fisherman does not know exactly how much produce they're actually going to procure from the sea or from the fresh water. And so there's a very clear need for standardization. There's a need for sorting and a need for fulfillment. And listen, in every marketplace, these needs are different. This is just an example that we've shown here. But it's really important for founders to figure out ways in which they can diversify their supply base. So when you start out, you'd want to build liquidity in one type of supply. But in order to build defensibility and a long-term moat, it's important to think through how you can continue to diversify the supply side of your marketplace. Next, software. Because of how complex some of these buying processes are, we believe that software is extremely crucial, and nearly every B2B marketplace that we've come across is either thinking about building software, has already built it. We came across a Gartner survey a few years ago, and what they'd done is they'd quizzed B2B buyers on what are the top 3 challenges in terms of launching or just fulfilling B2B needs. And the 3 top things that came up were, one was lack of integration to other systems. Second was lack of development resources. And the third was the total cost of the project in order to build themselves. And we believe that solving for these issues can really unlock a lot of liquidity in these rather opaque markets. We've highlighted three things around software that we think are pretty important. There are many others. I'll start out with workflow. So these are the sorts of tools that really enable communication between the buyer and the supplier. They help replace spreadsheets, but in most cases, it's paper, fax, and email, and just digitize a lot of the documentation that's done in offline marketplaces today. So Sender is a classic example where a lot of this communication was done via the phone. And so buyers would typically call their truck operators and say, hey, where's the truck? It's supposed to be delivered today. It's not here. Where is it? And what Sender has done is has created dashboards where people can see in real time exactly where a good is and how long it'll take to reach. Recce is another example in the B2B food supply marketplace where they connect chefs to food suppliers, and all this communication is done over chat versus calling each other and going back and forth. The next is around data and analytics, and we think that software can be used for the purposes of automated matching and just providing transparency to the different players. What this does is it makes a lot of these marketplaces self-serve and removes the need for human interaction, whether it's related to matching or whether it's related to coordination. Fair, again, to use the example of Fair, did an excellent job analyzing which brands were selling what. And what they did with that data is they were able to go to retailers and say, hey, we know you've not bought from these set of brands, but we can guarantee you that if you do purchase from them, that you'll sell their goods. And if you're not able to, we'll take them back. So, and it was the power of data and integrating with some of the existing systems that brands had that enabled them to do this. And finally, integrations. Integrating with ERP systems, with suppliers, really helps overcome the chicken and egg problem that a lot of these marketplaces face. I know some of the earlier conversations spoke about this, and I know a lot of founders face that problem, especially in the early days. So we've mentioned Zetwork, which is an Accel portfolio company as well, and they deal in a supply-constrained marketplace. So what they've done is they built tools to onboard supply. And effectively, what they help supply do is digitize, create a digital profile, and also build a history of all the transactions that they had with customers. So what it meant is when demand came online searching for these suppliers, they were able to immediately and really quickly know exactly which supplier can fulfill their needs. And that's what really kickstarted the marketplace and got them going. Each market, each vertical will need a different type of software solution. And it's really up to founders to figure out what that solution is and implement it accordingly. And then finally, the number 5 is financial services. And I know that some of my friends I see them at the back at Adyen are going to talk about this in a bit. But we think that financial services will play a very big role in B2B marketplaces. Financial services come in many forms. I've listed embedded payments, which includes banking services, debit cards. Working capital is a big part of it as well. And then finally, insurance and invoice management. So Cogita, wanted to use the example of Cogita, which using working capital and financial management has done an excellent job in offering suppliers better terms than what they get in offline markets today. What they also do is allow buyers who are typically already used to paying at 30 days, 60 days, even better terms than what they have. And finally, they've layered in insurance. And effectively, they're able to tell a buyer that, hey, we guarantee you that these goods will be OK. And if not, you can have them back. And what this does is, in marketplaces where the margins and take rates are typically lower than in B2C marketplaces, it really allows these marketplaces to increase their take rates and thereby make unit economics work. Inframarket is another player in India. And what they're doing is they're basically a marketplace to transport cement and building materials from a supplier to the construction site. So very commoditized product. And the question the founders had when they started is, how do we differentiate? How do we really set ourselves apart? And what they did is they effectively embedded a bank and a fintech within their marketplace. So they were able to offer better rates to suppliers, better rates to demand. And that's exactly how their GMV was able to grow. And now they're a very sizable marketplace in India. Another very important factor, and that's actually what you see on the left, is that marketplaces in developed markets have so far, I think, had the luxury of working and operating in a capital environment that means interest rates are really low, and so capital costs have traditionally been very low. What we've seen in the last few months, and I think we'll hear more and more of, is interest rates rising, and that means that this factor around working capital, around interest rates, which was previously, I think, restricted largely to developing markets, is going to become a very crucial factor for us in Europe, as well as in the developed world. And it's something for founders to keep a close eye on. All right, so those are the 5 things that we think founders should really focus on. And the last thing that I'll speak of, and is a question I get asked a lot, is what is it that Accel truly looks at, and what do we need to aim for, and how do we think about growing and raising funding, whether from us or from other investors. And we've laid out 5 things that we think are really important. So first and foremost, as with any growing business, team matters. And for us, a team that has a deep domain knowledge or has some experience that gives them a unique insight into the space is crucial. Given B2B purchasing behaviors are so complex, having the ability to build trust with both your buyers and suppliers is extremely important. Next is the market, and obviously having a large market is important, but ensuring that it's highly fragmented, especially on the supply side and ideally on the buyer side, is crucial as well. Oops. The next thing is stickiness. I was speaking to a marketplace founder just earlier today, and he said, Varun, 3 things that matter in marketplaces: retention, retention, retention. So, it's clearly, it's a core part of growing a marketplace. You have to have the users coming back. And that can be, manifested in many ways. One could be purchase frequency, and the other is about how your share of wallet with your existing players and existing buyers is increasing. And especially in the early days when you don't have as much scale, one of the ways we look or search for product market fit is trying to see how that share of wallet continues to grow in the small base of buyers and suppliers that you have. Fourth is liquidity. Trying to figure out ways in which you can easily help suppliers and buyers to interact and transact with one another is really crucial. How you can deliver quick value to these market participants, and really understanding how quickly. So let's say a supplier lists a product or a good, how quickly can it be fulfilled? And that's a key aspect of understanding how successful that marketplace is likely to be moving forward. And finally, software and financial services, and what that monetization potential is likely to be. It's not an easy space to monetize. We see a lot of players, with rising GMVs, and in fact, we recommend that founders focus on growing GMV and not spending too much time on thinking of how to monetize, at least in the early days. But that needs to come, and using financial services, using software to bring that monetization to bear is really crucial. Yeah, so hopefully this gives you an eye behind the curtain and gives you a sense of how we look at marketplaces, and and open to more questions as they come up.
And by the way, we know that is a lot, right? This list is pretty long and quite tough, right? But at the same time, it is important, in our opinion, to share this openly because it helps you understand, especially in the early stage, where to focus on. We feel this is actually a good advice that over the years has been helpful for many of our companies.
Nothing? Are you guys tired?
Feels
right,
like.
How many B2B marketplace founders in the room? How many?
Oh,
higher. All right, and you guys don't have any questions.
OK, but at least half of the room. So
yeah,
we're not expecting that much. That's good.
Exactly. All right, she's got a question. Cool. Do I have to run? Oh, you've got...
I'll let him go first.
OK. Right.
Do you want to go first?
Should I go? All right.
Go on.
Am I on? Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot for the presentation. So you definitely have a lot of experience with B2B. So my biggest curiosity is, have you ever identified a common barrier or mistakes in the company in your portfolio that repeats itself? And if so, what is it and what's the solution to it?
Wow, that's a good one. You want to take it a stab, Varun?
I can start. I think one thing I've seen sometimes is, as an example, I spoke about heterogeneous supply and building, trying to build that long-term defensive moat. I think sometimes founders, spread themselves too far, too quickly. I think, and that's driven by different needs. It's sometimes because you either want to expand geographically, sometimes you want to just scale your GMV, and hence you try and increase those verticals in which you play. I think it's really important in those early days to just be really focused and try and build liquidity in that one sub-vertical, one vertical. And often we've seen sometimes people try too much. You have to sort of rein them back in and really understand, where is it that you can find product market fit. And then once you've nailed it, then use that playbook and replicate it across verticals. So that's what I would say.
And I have another one, which is, you use a beautiful slide, Varun, that was simple, which is this one. We have seen, in many ways, founders getting ahead of themselves and maybe trying to focus on one specific part of the value chain without fully understanding the whole value chain. Ultimately, the margin you're going after in a value chain, it is your business. And I think you have multiple of examples of companies that failed because they didn't realize how small or how big it was, the margin pool they were going after. So having a full understanding of the value chain you decided to attack, I think is a common mistake usually that I've seen in founders early on.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. It's sort of related to the same point, the Airbnb slide. And I was interested to know your thoughts on multi-sided marketplaces. So, a lot of people, I think, sort of balk at if it becomes too complex. So I'm thinking about marketplaces with multi-sided supply side. So I wanted to understand, with your thoughts around this slide, what you thought about multi-sided marketplaces and whether that adds to the moat effect, or your first instincts is that it's an added complexity.
My first instinct is that is adding complexity for sure, but sometimes it's needed. So some of the third-sided marketplace that you've seen becoming successful, we're adding some value by doing so. I think in B2B marketplace we've seen less, to be honest. We've seen more in B2C. We've seen somehow the better version of three-sided marketplace by what Varun described before about software and augmenting software tools and financial service tools within your marketplace. That's, to me, the most efficient way of creating more stickiness instead of looking for additional complexity, if it makes sense. I think we had someone here.
Yeah, you had a slide on the type of businesses that start more as a tool rather than a marketplace first, and then they build a marketplace on top. Yeah, I feel that for some businesses, you go there after a while, after years. So I just wanted to understand if you can expand more on what's the best path to get there, if you should get there the sooner or rather later. Yeah, if you can expand a bit the scope there.
I don't think, as you said, you can either build just the software by itself and then you bring, once you've addressed almost that single player use case, you can then think of connecting, the suppliers to the buyers. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way of doing this. But what I do think is that, at least as it relates to B2B, I think you need to bring in software earlier rather than later. And that's primarily because, there are some of these inefficiencies which it's not as simple as just connecting 2 parties or 3 parties in a marketplace. You actually need to, they won't change their behavior just for that. You need to actually make them, help them do things faster. And that's a pure software play rather than just connecting them to buyers, if that makes sense. So I think the summary is that I don't think there's a right or wrong way in which way you start, but I do think with B2B you need to bring software in earlier rather than later.
I've got one.
I've got one also.
All right.
You go.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'll just come back to the share of wallet because it's been coming up a couple of times today, and it can range from 1% to 100%, right? So what's the number you look at and you consider it as a good starting point?
I would say there's no specific number. It's more about, first and foremost, as Varun said, seeing that growing up. I think ultimately a good reason to exist for a marketplace is having buyers and sellers happy, and buyers and sellers, if are happy, they should come back. So seeing that that is evolving toward time in a positive territory, it's very hard to point a number, but we've seen as high as 60 to 70%, even at early stage.
And I can maybe give you sort of a tangible example from our portfolio. So, Sender is an example. They work with, big customers, big brands. And from the point of view of those customers, they'd never, you'd never be in a situation where you hand all your business to one freight forwarder. So by just market dynamics, a company like Sender is limited in terms of how much share of wallet they can get at any one customer. However, the market itself is so large that they even getting 50-60% of share of wallet for name a big brand or retailer is enough to build a really large business. So I think each marketplace, the dynamics are different. There are other marketplaces where customers or demand side will be okay having 100% share from the marketplace, and they're totally fine. So that's where I think the dynamics vary. But as an example, Sender typically gets to 50, 60, 70% of the bigger players.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. I had a question about cohort retention. Specifically, what have you seen companies do well to keep cohort retention plus 100% for as long as they can, or to actually grow above the initial purchase value?
What do you want to use? I think probably, I get my first reaction to it. Cohorts are just an output, right? So I wouldn't say they're just one factor. I think we mentioned over the lines of all these points, things that can help you have a better business. If you have a better business, you'll have better output, and the retention is one of those outputs. So it is a mix of many things that we discussed, I would say. So there's no one silver bullet, but it's really cracking all of this. But ultimately, it's about ability to deliver value to your buyers and sellers.
Thank you.
And it's really about trust, right? So as long as you can execute that transaction end to end, you're going to bring them back. And obviously, cost is a key component, because if it's more expensive, it's not going to be easy for them to continue to transact. But if you can show that you can deliver on what you promised, they'll come back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also from my side, excellent presentation. I have a very specific question about FAIR, because FAIR came onto the scene with this massive funding round, I think 400 million or so, and before that they had raised 12 million. What changed in between?
We are not shareholders, so I wish I had the answer for you. I think FAIR has been a successful model that has been in the making. So I think so we use FAIR on this slide. I think FAIR did a few things very well. I think first and foremost, they addressed a very large category, and they went for a big pain in the value chain. In their case, it was the sales discovery. That hook was so massive for them that the growth came by itself. And the share of wallet point that we discussed before, going through the roof very early on, and the flywheel really accelerated quickly. It's a good example of a company that understood the value chain, started with a clear pain to go after. That margin opportunity that you see at the bottom of that slide was big enough for them to having a good effect to begin with, and then they expanded into payments and financial services to unlock even more. So I think
they also did a great job with just data. So they knew, to what I alluded to earlier, they just knew which brands did really well and which brands' products were selling. And so they could confidently, because as a retailer, you typically procure from brands where you know that produce or those goods are going to sell. Otherwise, you've paid for some goods and you don't know what to do with them. So what FAIR unlocked is they basically said, hey, we can show you new brands, so you get new goods to put on your shelf, but we guarantee you that if you don't sell it, we'll take it back. But guess what? They knew that the products of these brands were going off the shelf. So that's what they hacked. And this is, again, what we know publicly. We're not shareholders, but that's, I think, what really unlocked things for them.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. B2B marketplaces often have different revenue streams, mainly transaction fees and software fees. Do you see a good proportion or a pattern in terms of how much one should represent compared to another? And maybe second question, how do you value these businesses? And so how do you value the different revenue streams that they represent when you invest or when you look at a potential exit opportunity in 5 years or 7 years from now?
So I'll take the first part of the question. In terms of the fees, no, there's no sort of fixed way in which how you can monetize. But the reason why financial services and software, we highlighted these 2 points, is because on average, we've seen that take rates on the B2B marketplace side are lower than what you can do on the B2C side. So if I were to compare, and it's difficult to compare apples to apples, but you would need to embed software and financial services to make up for that reduction in transaction fees that you would typically take from a B2B marketplace. So the share of software, financial services, other ancillaries will likely be higher on the B2B side versus the B2C side.
Second part of the question that is a bit more difficult. There's no predefined way, and to be honest, there are not that many successful cases that are somehow listed. No? If you think about large B2B marketplace on a global scale, it's not that we can mention 10 of those that are maybe multi-billion-dollar businesses listed somewhere. So we came to the conclusion that despite being a bit early in terms of exit valuations potential, we see all the merits for B2B marketplace to be valued as B2C marketplace if the right condition applies. And the right conditions are stickiness, of course, addressing large market, and being able to capture a significant size of a value chain. So we don't see any fundamental reason why they should be valued differently.
So we went from no questions to many questions. So we'll take one more over here. Or you can catch them after the break, please. Cool. You're the lucky person.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. My question was around the sort of user experience. Obviously, for B2C marketplaces, the user experience and the social contract you build with your customers is really important, especially in the consumer space. For B2B marketplaces, and obviously thinking a bit about Fair, but any other companies that you would have invested in or came across, I'd love to get your insights in terms of user experience sort of impact that you've seen in the last, I would say, couple of years, and any impact of sort of more focus and investment on that for B2B sort of buyers.
Maybe I'll take a stab at it. So I think with user experience, the one difference we've seen is typically on the B2C side, it just has to be really simple, easy to use, and time to value should be relatively straightforward. So if, for example, if I'm ordering something on Uber, I just want 2 clicks and hopefully the order is done. On B2B, the challenge and also what's really interesting is the fact that you typically have a few buyers or a few personas that you need to convince in that journey. So it actually makes it slightly more complex or complicated, addressing the needs of these different buyers. So I think the challenge for founders here is identifying, hey, which is the most important buyer, but how do we make sure that no one else in this purchasing process will block us? So that is the balance that you need to achieve. But yeah,
I was putting this slide because exactly what Varun just said. Consumer delight is relatively easy to measure. B2B delight is way more difficult to measure. But first and foremost, is about making sure that everybody's happy with the status quo, right? The status quo you bring needs to be well-functioning for all the people involved in a purchasing decision. That's table stakes. And then how to delight them, in my opinion, is by simplifying their life. At the end of the day, you are helping them bring in more efficiency, not just from a cost perspective, but from user ability perspective. Less time dedicated to emails, communication, less time dedicated to repetitive tasks. That's the way I would say that.
Perfect. Round of applause, everybody.